This is Congresswoman Virginia Foxx with a congressional update. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the issues related to debt and deficit, two terms that are often used interchangeably but are quite different items, and to discuss the state of the economy in the United States and how that's impacting families and people in the 5th Congressional District. And I'm very pleased to have with me today Alison Fraser with the Roe Institute at the Heritage Foundation. Alison, tell me and the people who are going to watch this a little bit about yourself and about the Roe Institute and about Heritage.
Great.
Give yourself a commercial.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm the director of the Roe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation, and what we do is to provide the conservative solutions to today's economic issues. And we really do two things. One is to follow very closely the current debates on various economic issues on Capitol Hill, and to provide our own solutions to them. And so what we deal with are things like federal spending, taxes, regulation, energy and environment, the economy writ large, especially federal kinds of issues. So it's been a very, very busy year and a half, but I'm very pleased to be here. We have a wonderful website, heritage.org, if anybody's curious about our policy solutions for today.
Right. Well, Heritage does a wonderful job of providing not just members of Congress with information, but citizens all over the country. In writing letters to people who write me about, well, why do you support this instead of that? I often refer them to Heritage and to your website so they'll see what are the recommendations and why I am the strong conservative that I am. And I answered a letter just last night when the man said to me, why do you do this? I said, well, a life lived with experiences that tell me that conservative principles are the way to go, but you don't have to take my word for it. Here's some other sources to back me up. So I'm always very grateful for the Heritage work, the wonderful pieces that you put out that have such great substance. So I thank you very much. Well, I'm going to give you a sort of a hard task here.
Oh dear.
But I know you're up to it. Explain the difference between the federal deficit and the debt. Those terms, as I said, are often used interchangeably and sometimes used incorrectly, even by people who should know better.
Right. Well, quite simply, the deficit is how much more on a yearly basis. In Washington, we say on an annual basis. So how much more on a yearly basis Congress spent than it took in. And last year, 2009, we know Congress spent way more than it took in, $1.4 trillion. Now, the debt is when you take the sum of those deficits over the years and add it all up together. So in 2008, at the end of 2008, the debt held by the public was about $5.8 trillion. Add $1.4 trillion to that, and you see how big publicly held debt over, writ large is for the United States government.
Right. Well, talk a little bit about what makes up that debt, and then I'll go back to the deficit with a question.
Yeah, there are two kinds of debt. One is the debt that's held by the public. So as Congress writes checks, and they write checks in excess of the tax revenues it receives, it needs to borrow money. So in order to borrow money, it will go out and issue treasuries, and that's generally known, the sum of all of that is generally known as the debt held by the public. Congress will also borrow money from other sources like, say, the Social Security Trust Fund, and to them they issue merely an IOU. So when you add that to the debt, we're getting a much bigger number of about $12 trillion, but that's called the total debt or consolidated debt.
Right. So right now, my understanding is we're a little over $12 trillion. The Congress in December, right at the end of December, raised the debt limit, I think $300 billion or something like that.
About that, right.
Right. And it's estimated that the debt limit's going to have to be raised to about $14 trillion. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
that's right. I mean, it was known that the debt limit would need to be increased substantially, and so there will be a second larger installment of increasing the debt limit that will be happening shortly after we're taping this show today, and that's rumored to be somewhere in the neighborhood of about $850 billion, all told an increase in about $1.2 trillion. It really is two things. It's to cover spending that was already put in play sort of budgetarily by the laws that were passed last calendar year, like in December. It's also to cover sort of a down payment on future spending that's going to happen through this budget year. And I kind of look at the debt limit as the aspirin that needs to happen for spending excesses of the past.
Right. Now, let's go back just a second to the deficit, because you define that as the difference between what the federal government spends over what it has taken in. Mention just a little bit about, again, where the federal government gets its money, because I am always talking about the fact that the federal government's money doesn't come like manna from heaven.
Right.
It has sources. So mention a little bit about what those sources are.
Well, the biggest sources, the biggest three, come from taxes that you and I pay. Two of them come from taxes that you and I pay, and those are income taxes and payroll taxes. Payroll taxes are also known as FICA. So if you're going to look at your pay stub, you see federal income taxes being withheld, and you see FICA taxes being withheld. The other large source comes from corporate income taxes, and we pay those. We just don't know that we pay them because they're in the form of prices that are passed on to us in the products that we buy. But getting back to our paychecks, one of the reasons I think that most people just think that, you know, this funding of the federal government is sort of magic is because, you know, it's sort of magically taken out of our paychecks. We don't really write a check, for most of us, for what we pay the federal government in terms of taxes. They take care of that for us with our employers. That's why it's not enough real pain for us to feel what Congress and the federal government are doing to us.
Well, it hasn't always been that way, has it?
No, it hasn't always been that way. Historically, we didn't even have an income tax, and when it was initially passed, you know, in the last century, it was very low, and you had to pay it. You had to write a check, and it was generally the higher income earners. And then as the federal government grew and the appetite for revenues grew, one of the changes that they made in addition to increasing who paid it and how much they paid was to begin this thing called automatic withholding.
Right. And actually, I've introduced a bill that would say that people would write the check again. They would have to pay their withholding taxes.
That's right.
At the end of the year.
Right.
So people would understand exactly how much they're paying.
That's exactly right. And what happens is, you know, when you file your tax return at the end of the year, if you, what we call in the trade, over withheld, you let your employer take out too much tax money for you, and you get a check back, you think you're getting money back from the government. You're getting your own money back.
Exactly. And that's another misconception that's developed over the years in our country, again, giving that false impression that the money that the government has is government money.
That's right. But you know who is very, very well aware of that? Our small business owners and those folks who are self-employed. Why? They've got to write those checks themselves.
And they do it
They
do it quarterly.
Right.
And they're heavily fined if they don't pay on time. I know, having had a small business, understand that. So they're much more aware of what the government is doing to them. So how much concern should Americans have about our level of deficits and the increases in the national debt? Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that I would say is it's normal, really. It's not necessarily an evil thing to have debt or deficits for the federal government, or for that matter, for individuals. I mean, I've got a mortgage. That's debt. All right, so it's not unreasonable to have a little bit of debt. For the government, if there's an extraordinary thing that happens in the world or the economy, or if there's a war or something like that, or a special thing that needs to happen, not unusual. But the debt and the deficits that we're looking at in today's levels are alarming, and Americans should be truly concerned for two reasons. Just some numbers: historical levels of debt or deficits, the annual deficit, is about 2.5% of the economy. Well, the deficit we had last year was 10% of the economy. Truly astounding. Last time we had a deficit that large was during World War II. The buildup or the cumulative level of debt that we're having, also very alarming. Now, much of this was driven, of course, by the financial meltdown and the recession that we are in today. It's driven by two factors: the decline in tax revenues as the economy tanked, but also massive spending increases from the bailouts. Those things are supposed to be temporary. What's not temporary is this huge spending tsunami that's coming our way very, very soon from Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So this short-term spike in debt is really building a debt bridge to the long-term fiscal unsustainability of these three programs. And that really needs to scare Americans. Couple more numbers. The average level of debt held by the public over the last 50 years has been about 36% of the economy. And over the long term, say within 2 generations, these three programs will push that to 400% of the economy. Okay, to put that in a number that your constituents understand, what we're talking about from these three programs alone is a debt for every man, woman, and child in your district and in America of $184,000. Okay, they need to be concerned about that. That's where we're headed.
Right now, it's about $39,000. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, if you just take the federal debt that we have today, but if you add on top of it the unfunded promises from Social Security, Medicare, then you're getting up to that $184,000 number.
Right. And the government has made lots of promises. And it's a concern, again, to young people and older people too.
Well, it is, because, you know, older people want to know that their benefits are going to be affordable and sustainable. But I have traveled all across the nation, and every person that I have talked to, every retiree, everybody getting ready to retire, everyone with high school age kids, they don't want to be those kind of stewards for younger Americans. I've met people who are retired living on fixed incomes, and they're willing to give a little up to give their grandkids a better life.
Right. And the more debt we have, the greater problem we have, because higher interest rates, higher interest has to be paid. So we create a spiral that's very difficult to get out of, just as individuals do.
That's right.
That's right. We should look on this in the same way we'd look on individuals. Most of us wouldn't take on unsustainable debt. We shouldn't be happy when the government does that, correct?
That's exactly right.
Well, Alison, I really appreciate your coming in and talking with me and explaining these things. I try to do it, but I much prefer to have somebody who does it on a day-to-day basis and speaks so eloquently. So I appreciate your coming in.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure.
Oh, it's been a delight. This is Congresswoman Virginia Foxx with a congressional update, and with me today has been Alison Fraser of the Rowe Institute with the Heritage Foundation.